Today we're going to do a valve adjustment or valve shim job on this 2006 CRF 250X. Now shim adjustment or a shim replacement, I guess you could say, on these bikes is pretty common. Any of the high revving 4-strokes nowadays, because the springs are so tight on those to be able to allow the valve to pull back so quickly in a high rev, it has so much force that it will smash up against the head itself, and the valve seat will slowly recess up into the head. Now, when that happens, what will usually happen on your bike is it'll be harder to start. Instead of 1 or 2 kicks, it might take 10, 12, 15 kicks. But other than that, usually the bikes will still run okay. You just might have a slight decrease in power. After a valve adjustment or a shim job, the bike should start up first or second kick max. Now, we're going to look at exhaust valves and intake valves. Generally, I see the exhaust valves going first. They'll recess in a little bit. But on some of these model years, for the Honda bikes, they were known to have some head issues, and you would have intake valve recession as well. But in either case, you can adjust them for a little while. After 3, sometimes 4 adjustments, sometimes the valve itself will recess so far in there won't be any more room to allow for adjustment, and at that time you have to do a new head. It's only a matter of time. A lot of people are afraid that after you have a valve adjustment that it's not going to last much longer. You can put a lot of hours on before it's going to be time to do a head again. But at some point on any of these, you'll end up having to reseat the head, and there's aftermarket kits to do that as well. Start by removing the seat, use it with the 2 rear seat bolts. Then take the plastics off the tank. You can leave them on if you want to, but then take the tank out and disconnect it at the petcock and remove the tank off the bike. Underneath the tank, we're going to remove the valve cover. These are 2 10mm bolts. There's a little gasket washer underneath them, so don't lose that. Take those out and then remove the spark plug wire or coil pack. And then remove this little breather tube off the back and take the valve cover off. Then we're going to rotate the engine over until we hit top dead center. The 2 lobes there on the cam will be pointing backwards. And then you look at this timing gear and look at the timing marks, one on the left and one on the right. It should be level with the metal of the valve deck. And that's where the engine is top dead center. Then we'll remove that side case inspection point for the timing. There's one on both sides. There it is removed. You can see that dot lines up with that arrow. And as we remove this side, there's another dot in here that also lines up. If the bike's running good, these are going to be spot on. You're timed right. Next, we're going to remove the timing chain tensioner. You can just adjust it to loosen the slack on the chain. My preference is to remove it completely. It's simpler. It's 2 8mm bolts, one on top, one on bottom, and it comes right off. Then we'll take to the top of the motor the bearing caps for the cam. You don't have to take these off yet, but my preference is that I do. Then make sure you don't lose the bearing keeper rings that are right there. We're going to start with the intake valves. Intakes on these should have 5,000 clearance, plus or minus 1,000. A lot of guys will set them right around 6. You push underneath where the lobe is, and I did it at 5,000s there. It didn't fit. I'm going to move to 3,000s. We're going to push underneath right where the lobe is, and that one fits. Okay, so then I'm going to go to 4,000s and see if I can get the 4 to fit. So there's my 4,000s feeler gauge, and the link to this tool is in the description as well. Put it underneath, and that does not fit. So we know we have 3,000s clearance, and we're going to remove the cam now. And I just did it for one side. You do the same for both sides. What we're measuring is between that lobe, the cam itself, but the lobe is out of the way, and this little cap right here. That cap is going to sit right there, and we're putting a feeler gauge in between there. Underneath the cap, there's a spot that's going to be pushing into that valve bucket, and there's this little valve shim that is basically just a spacer that is sitting inside the valve bucket, and you can see this one's 2mm shim. And just special note, the shims are usually done in millimeters, and the measuring tools we use, at least here in the US, are in thousandths, so you would have to convert them. My experience is basically open up your valve shim kit, find the shim that matches. Okay, so mine was a 2, and we're just going to go one size down. Sometimes we'll go all the way to 2 sizes down, depending on how much clearance we have. You put that in there and measure it again. Sometimes what you can do is put the 2 shims next to each other and see how close they are. But in this case, we're just going to go one size down, put it in place where it goes. In this video, I've switched over to the second one. Okay, they were both the same. They're not always exactly the same. We're going to put the cap on. Remember, that cap is going to go against this lobe right here. And then our feeler gauge is going to go in between the lobe and the cap. Okay, so here's our feeler gauge. I grabbed a random size, we jam it between there, and that's what we're looking for. 5 thousandths, 6 thousandths, right in there. You can look at your owner's manual for the exact spec. Put that cap back on. We're going to put our cam back in place with the timing in the correct position. It doesn't actually have to be exactly top dead center for measuring, but it is good practice. You just want it so that the lobe on the cam is not interfering with your measurement. So those just need to be pointed backwards. We'll grab our 5 thousandths out, slide the 5 thousandths feeler gauge underneath the cam, and it fits perfectly. Next, we're going to put the bearing caps back on. Remember these keeper rings that fits right on the bearing. It's a little half circle. Then the bearing cap goes on. Make sure that lines up directly on the keeper ring. The bearing can float side to side. The cap cannot. So you have to move the bearing until that keeper ring sets. And you might give a little tiny tap to push it down, but not too much. Same for the other side. These caps are labeled left and right. They only fit one way. We'll put that on there as well. And remember, move the cam bearing. The bearing caps don't move. I didn't show this in the disassembly, but this rocker arm right here, that's going to set in place, and this little rocker arm pin goes through the side of the valve deck aluminum and locks the rocker arm in place. That has to be there. All of this has to be set in place to do the exhaust shimming or measurements. So I'm going to grab my size. 11 thousandths is the magic number for this one, or 0.011. And we're going to measure across there and make sure that fits. We'd go down to 10, down to 9, 8, 7, and until we figure out what size we need. Then we're going to remove that rocker arm pin again. Sometimes that can be a bit of a pain. Just gently pry and pull it out till it's clear. Then once it's out, you're going to remove the rocker arm right there. So that's out. And then we're going to go in here with a magnet and lift the shims out of the valve bucket. So that's shim number 1. And based on the measurement that I took, we're going to usually go to a smaller shim, because as these wear out, you lose clearance. You can use a dial vernier caliper and measure them. If you can't read the number on them, most of the time you can't. We'll go to our shim kit. Now, a lot of times these little dial vernier calipers, especially that one, they're kind of garbage. And so what I do is go find the shim that it should be, and I'll measure that one as well. After I pick the correct shim, that shim goes into the valve bucket. Remember, shims are in millimeters, and the tolerances we're measuring are in thousandths of an inch. So you're going to have to do that adjustment. We'll put that rocker arm back in place with the pin. It's all set up. We'll take our measurement. We're looking for 11 thousandths. Common saying is a loose valve is a happy valve. Just get it right at 11 thousandths. As you get tighter and tighter, that's what makes bikes harder to start. If you notice, our timing chain was not on. I do most of this without the timing chain on, so it's easy to adjust and pull things in and out. So now we're going to put our cam back in place. I took those bearing caps off. I'm resetting everything, and this cam, we're going to slide it underneath the chain, the timing chain, and remember that tensioner is out, so it allows us a little more room to fit the cam in there. Usually have to rock the cam on its side, and then once you get it all set in place, you're going to look for those timing marks. I'm going to show you in just a second. Those timing marks, as soon as I get there, timing marks are going to be exactly flat with the top of the valve deck. Now, some people are really worried about, is it exactly flat? Well, it just can't be a tooth off. So if you look at the distance in one of your teeth, make sure those timing marks are pretty dang spot on, not more than a tooth off. We're going to tighten all of our components back in place, put our cam tensioner, or excuse me, our timing chain tensioner back on. The way to get this on is you actually have to put a really skinny screwdriver in there, tighten it up. That removes the tension off that spring-loaded tensioner. You tighten the two 8mm bolts in place, and then you can let go of the screwdriver and it will snap back and put tension back on the timing chain. So these guys are getting tight. If you don't put tension on with the screwdriver, then those bolts, you're going to be binding and it's not going to work. So you have to use a screwdriver. We'll put this 8mm cap in. All that does is keep dirt out of there. Does not need to be tight. It'll keep oil from leaking out of there as well for the little bit that splashes up there. Now we look at our marks. Look at those marks. One on the left, one on the right. Those are exactly on target. Okay, they're level with the top of the valve body. We'll come down here and make sure these are still on, which they should be. There's our dot. They should be on because we did not rotate the engine. If you did, you'd have to rotate these back until you get them lined up. Here's the other one. You can see that dot on the tooth with the triangle on the case lined up as well. Again, we just don't want it to be a tooth off. So all these should line up pretty easily, pretty perfectly. We're going to go back and reinstall everything that we just took apart. Again, you can kind of pick your order on this. This is my preference. Put those bearing caps back on, put the keepers back on, and that rocker arm we already put back on. Now these bolts, as you put them through, they actually keep that bearing, that rocker pin in place. So those bolts have to line up right. Put the cam bearing caps back on. These should be torqued down to 12 foot-pounds or 144 inch-pounds. Just good and tight without stripping them out. It's going to be just fine. Put your valve cover back in place. Make sure that that gasket going all the way around seats perfectly before you start pushing anything down. Once it's all in place, you're going to push it down nice and snug. It should be completely snug all the way around. We'll put these bolts back in place, those little 10mm, and bolt them down. They do not need to be very tight, just snug down. And then we'll put our spark plug wire back in place, that coil pack. We'll put these caps back in place for inspection of the timing. We'll put the gas tank back on, hook up our fuel lines, and just do a once over on the bike, make sure everything's complete and back together. We'll put plastics back on. I won't show you that. Seat back on, and then start up. When valves are properly adjusted, bikes should start in half a kick or half of a crank on the starter. Very easy to start. Thanks for watching.